Got a great film to play next.
Hello?
Have you ever snubbed a lady?
We had a technical problem.
Are we on?
Yeah, we're on there.
Can I swear? Shit!
Welcome to Crunch and Roll, a podcast about the side of the radio industry that most people never hear about, featuring some of its most interesting characters. My name is John Fox, and I've presented the Odd Breakfast Show here and there around the country over the last couple of decades. So I like to think I'm qualified to ask my guests the questions that we're all dying to hear the answers to. All of our guests tell great stories about familiar names that we all know in the industry, but probably the most spoken about and impersonated person in recent episodes has been Clive Dickens. Trouble is, he's in Australia nowadays and, well, we're not. So early, very early, one Sunday morning, I chatted to him about his stellar career in radio management. We spoke about how Elton John was responsible for getting his foot in the door of the industry, how he nearly introduced Posh and Becks for the very first time, and also how you go about trying to buy a massive radio group. Now, before we start, just our regular reminder that if you do enjoy the podcast, then we'd be eternally grateful for any support you can give us on Ko-fi. Just go to ko-fi.com/crunch and roll. It's as simple as that. Are you ready? Let's crunch and roll. Oh, yeah. Clive, good morning.
Good morning, John. How are you doing?
I'm really good. Really good. Thank you so much for coming on Crunch and Roll. Were you slightly reluctant to come on?
Absolutely. I mean, for a start, into my dodgy Australian accent, what happened? I've only been here 10 years and I sound like I'm stuck somewhere between Melbourne and Sydney, and I grew up North London. So I don't know what happened. So people like me shouldn't be speaking. We should be seen, not heard, and in the background. So let's see how this goes.
It's quite interesting because all the guests that I've spoken to that have been in management have all been quite reluctant to come on Crunch and Roll. Dirk Anthony was like, I really don't know what I'm going to talk about. And I'm thinking, you ran a huge company. Like, you've got so much to talk about.
Yeah, look, it's part of our training, isn't it? It was never about us. It's about the listener and the community and the stories and the storyteller. We're the ringmasters. We're not the acts.
You are the most spoken about person on Crunch and Roll, and you are also equally with Richard Park the most impersonated person on Crunch and Roll. And I know that you've listened to many of the episodes. Do you think anybody has got your voice down to a T?
Well, it's one of the reasons why I changed my accent, John, just so I can plausible deniability that isn't me they were talking about, because they clearly got me confused. And look, as for being the most talked about, that's probably means I'm the oldest person you've ever had on. So I've been working in this crazy industry for 42 years, I counted. So, which is clearly not possible because I'm only 25 now. But so I think it's just it's a tenure thing. But I really enjoy listening to all the stories and crazy times, amazing stories, and great friends.
I also think it's worth noting that nobody's ever said a bad word about you.
Oh, I think there were some subtext there. I heard a few. I think people were very conscious of being on record, and that's fine. It's friendship came out of the adventures and stories, and he didn't go into radio to make friends. So I was like, there's a little fleeting mention in Chris Mills's book about the time we worked together. The words he used were firm but fair, and I thought, okay, I think I got away lightly if that's what Chris thought I was, firm but fair.
It's quite interesting having done research ahead of your episode, because you have reflected on your management style, haven't you? You've looked back and thought, maybe I got it wrong in parts.
Absolutely, yeah. I was so young. I started full-time at 15, paid at 15, didn't finish my A-levels, didn't finish my college, definitely didn't go to university, and just wanted to get into a radio station, and so naive. But I think in the end that the passion for the industry and the business made up for some of the naive and immature management style, or lack of management style. But hopefully over the time that got better. You like anything, you practice. 42 years.
The other thing that I found quite interesting, because a lot of the people I've spoken to and the people I know in the industry, when they talk about sharing their passion of wanting to get into radio with their parents, a majority of parents were quite persuasive in saying, well, why don't you try something else and then see if radio works out? But your parents were really encouraging, weren't they?
Yeah, they were amazing, particularly when you consider that their careers, my father was a policeman, my mother was a nurse, my sister was a lawyer and then became a foster parent, and my brother-in-law was an accountant, then became a primary school teacher in his retirement. And around the Christmas table, when everyone says what they were most proud of this year, they'd have real stories of real people, and be talking about hit records or Party in the Park or stunts, and it would be sort of pass the salt, Clive, but they may be the black sheep, but they never discouraged me. They did completely the opposite. And I don't really know where this sort of crazy love for entertainment came from, because none of my family had any background there. And my parents were just very, very supportive, which was great.
I'm right in thinking, because your dad was a police officer, he occasionally got a press office ticket, and you love Watford. That's your football team, and I'm really sorry about that, Clive. You can't be perfect.
Exactly, you can't pick your family, right? And you can only pick your football team once, and you can't change it. But look, it's my father worked at Watford Police. He occasionally got a press pass. I remember I actually supported, when I was very young, like 7, I initially supported Luton because I lived between Luton and Watford. And dad came up from work and said, "Oh, Elton John, the singer, has bought Watford." And I thought, and we should go, and I can get some tickets. So I flipped allegiance, but before the age of 10, I think that's allowed. And then just had this incredible career watching Watford from near bankruptcy of the then 4th division to the 2nd in the then was Division 1 to the Premier League and into Europe in 5 consecutive seasons. Basically, the Wrexham story and the Luton story of the last 5 years, but all those years ago. And it was just so exciting. And going week in, week out and listening to Watford Hospital Radio and listening to the coverage, the incredible Mike Vince, who was the voice of Watford, who's actually mentioned in both of Elton's biographies. And it was actually Mike who first, after a Watford game, said, "Well, if you're interested in Watford, that's great, because so am I, and why don't you come and have a look around the local radio station?" And one day after the match, and that's when everything changed. And I was so fortunate then to get it offered the job within a week, just literally photocopying and making the tea. But it was all started with Watford.
So you go to Chiltern, and you end up spending 11 years at Chiltern. Having done the research, I can't work out if you presented or not. Did you present on air?
Very badly, very badly. There are a few tapes around, mostly held by my mother in safe storage. I did mostly overnights when there was nobody left to fill, but myself and Anthony James, we used to present together. Anthony went on to be the creative genius behind the sonic identity of the Steve Wright Show on Radio 2. And obviously, tragically, we lost Steve recently, but Anthony's still incredibly productive in that industry. So we presented some terrible shows together. I did a few terrible late shows. And I remember Phil Fothergill and sitting me down saying, "Clive, I really don't think your career is destined in the studio. I think we could really find something for you to do in the office." So I was really grumpy for a while, and I stuck to my tape out to a whole bunch of other stations thinking, yes, no, Phil must be mistaken. I'm sure I'll be better than this. And I got a whole raft of letters back, saying, "No, we really think that you should definitely hang up the headphones and be in the office. And that was totally the right decision. I was a terrible, terrible host, but hopefully was able to guide a few careers along the way.
So the aim then was management, was it?
Well, the industry was so small in the 80s. It had no money. Every radio station apart from Capital lost money. We're coming off the back of a really deep recession in the early 80s. And so it wasn't it was almost like a cottage industry. So management of a cottage industry would be like saying sort of management of a, local pizza shop. You're not really a manager if there's no business there. So I'm not sure it was management. I wanted to be close to the music. I adored music. And this gave me a chance to play, go into the record library and listen to any song. So that was one thing. I loved storytelling and I love how radio made me feel. And then actually, by the time I was 21, I was, network controller, which is like a group program controller of a whole group of stations at 21, which was just, sort of happened. I've been working since 15, so I've been 5 or 6 years, but to have that level of responsibility given to me by, the legendary Colin Mason and Paul Robinson and Paul Chartler was just incredible. I think part of it was because I was obviously very cheap and, it wasn't about I want to be in management. It was about really wanting to have more influence over what came out of the car radio and the speakers and being at the heart of music and storytelling.
During your time at Chiltern, you worked very closely with Paul McKenna, and would I be right in saying that he was quite influential in your career?
Yeah, undoubtedly. Paul is and always was a genius. I became really close friends with him. We sort of worked together on some of his early hypnotic shows. Literally, I'd book the venues. I remember, the St Albans City Hall and the Watford College and the Dunstable Queensway Hall. I booked the venues and try and sell tickets, and I put banners up on roundabouts trying to get people to come. And Paul used to do this great gag where he used to start off by saying, I'm going to hypnotize everyone in the audience and I'm going to tell you what had a great time, and I'm going to send you home. But I remember a couple of the shows were so poorly attended because I did such a bad job promoting him because he was so talented that actually there wasn't even enough people to come up on the stage to be hypnotized at some of these shows. It was like, but he was on the Breakfast Show on Children Radio. He was just phenomenal. I was, worked with him 6 days a week. Actually, I was at the show where he first met the gentleman who first inspired him to become a hypnotherapist and a hypnotist, and just the way he could communicate, the way he could tell stories, the way that he could influence people. And he was a maverick as well. So Breakfast Show Radio, we'd go out and do remote broadcasting. We'd do lots of crazy things. He had this amazing stunt where the M1 motorway running through Hearts, Beds and Bucks was renowned in the 80s for being a constant contraflow of work because they were expanding the lanes. I think there was roadworks for about 3 years, and there was just these contraflows just had hundreds of thousands of traffic cones. And he woke up one morning, came in and said, I've got this idea. I think I want to represent the voice of the traffic cone. There are so many traffic cones in Hertfordshire. They must need a constituency, and I'm going to be the MP for the M1. And I think these traffic cones are underrepresented in Parliament. It became this brilliant stunt that ended up all over national media. And he just literally driving up on the motorway, he'd sort of have just this sort of brain. It was just wired very differently. So to see him now, this iconic sort of global superstar, it was always very obvious to me that he had some incredible special skills.
So 11 years at Chiltern, you left as the group program controller. It's after this that then you formed a relationship with Richard Park, because is it true that you met him at a conference and he invited you to go to Birmingham for a chat?
Yeah, there was this, I'd got pretty disillusioned with local radio between sort of 91 and 93. The regulation was really tough. The industry was was not making any money. We knew what great radio sounded like from the US, and we knew we couldn't do it with the radio authorities regulation. So I actually went off on a holiday to Thailand on my own. It was one of those sort of find yourself holidays. I'd not really had a gap year because I'd gone straight to work. So I went off an extended holiday and sort of came back in and started to apply for jobs outside of radio, which thankfully I didn't get because I was disillusioned. But one of the reasons I came back, I was booked to talk at this music radio conference by the Radio Academy, and I had to come back. I didn't want to let them down, so I sat on this panel and I just mouthed off pretty much about what was wrong with UK commercial radio. I mean, you got to remember, this is late 92, early 93. There was no regional radio. There was no second FMs in cities. You're still doing Lost Cats and Dogs and Dalavet on radio. There was no producers. There was no imaging. There was no coaching. It was just poor. London was pretty good. Capital was always great, and the main big cities, maybe Key and Piccadilly, and BRMB had some good content on it, but the industry was in a poor shape. And he contacted me afterwards and said, "I'll come for a chat." And we met up in Leicester Square. And to cut a long story short, that was the change of regulation just went through that allowed Capital to go and acquire other stations because they reached the ownership cap. So they went on this ownership spree where they acquired Midlands Radio and ultimately BRMB and all of the stations that formed the Capital Group. And he asked me to come and join the team to be group head of programs, looking after, at that point, all of the non-London content. And that was just an amazing time because it was, going to BRMB, working with Carl Ems and Phil Upton and Les Ross and Steve Priestley and Mike Tulin, and really redefining what sort of local radio would be in some of those big cities. And it was all happening at the same time because obviously EMAP were doing the same thing in the north of England, Metro Group were doing the same thing in the northeast, and Scottish Radio were doing the same thing in the north, and GWR were doing the same thing from the southwest. So we were all a bit of a land grab and who could buy what station first. And it was an incredible time. He was a fantastic mentor and just had a great instinct for what would work in a market. And I learned a huge amount from, I think we worked together for about 7 years after that.
Were you as scared of Richard Park as everybody else was?
No, because we had a very, very close relationship, and it wasn't fear. It was definitely he made you always want to put on your A game. So the only time you would feel nervous is if you knew that you hadn't brought your A game to work. And that was nerves about, but you would know that you hadn't brought your A game. And so, but it wasn't ever fear. I think if you're a presenter, then I definitely appreciate that some of the people who worked with him and worked with us would have been fearful at times. His management style evolved over that time as well. But it was always came from a big heart and a passion for success. But definitely between that, it wasn't a fear-based relationship. It was a trust relationship and about bringing your A game and wanting to move the industry and the business on.
Can you remember any times that you didn't bring your A game, Clive?
Oh yeah, definitely. Because you're talking about 20-something Clive, where you're like any 20-something, you get distracted. You're distracted by either life, relationships, other recreation, let's say, and it would be, and it was a complex, big job. So the times where you get distracted and you get nervous, and then you'd know those times. So yeah, I mean, there's probably too many to mention, but the reality is it's about self-reflection. If you know when you're not doing a great job, or you know when you've got to lift your game. It's the same now. We're always learning. And actually, it's nothing better than a boss that actually points out that you're not got your A game. My current boss is brilliant at that as well. She's phenomenal. And actually that's what you want from a leader. You want someone to empower you and mentor you and promote you and support you, but they also, by doing that, they need to tell you that isn't your best work. So that's all part of development.
When I was reading about you, would I be right in saying that the reason you moved on from that group is partly down to the Capital Cafes, which of course I believe was fairly successful in London, but then when they tried to roll it out, it didn't work as well. And then a new boss came in and said, we need to stop spending money on restaurants, which on reflection probably was the right idea. Let's forget about burgers and concentrate on making good content. But then was that a period in your life where you thought, I need to move on and do something else?
It wasn't connected to Capital Radio Restaurants. Capital Radio Restaurants was a really bad idea from the beginning, unfortunately. What was a good idea? The Capital Radio Cafe in London as a single venue was a great idea. Was very busy, was making lots of money. The bad idea was thinking that could be replicated across the country. And then the worst idea was then buying a £50 million restaurant company with 3 or 4 different brands and licenses all over the world. But the reason why the Capital Board did that is because, once again, by 97, they'd reached the regulatory ceiling again, and they're a public company, and the shareholders wanted growth, and you couldn't grow the business faster than the shareholders wanted. I wanted the company to go internationally. I wanted us to expand into Australia, actually. We were involved very closely with a failed bid to try and merge with Australia here in Sydney, because we could export our IP and import some of their IP. Still think to this day that would have made a phenomenal deal. We also got involved in a potential acquisition of a big group in Germany. German radio market is a fascinating market, but the board never felt it was either too far away or too big or too different. So they stuck with this idea of entertainment, and then ultimately the regulatory climate changed. And David Mansfield became CEO, and actually they were able to acquire the Century stations and Beat, which meant that the next wave of expansion was going to happen. And myself and David and Richard had a very frank conversation where they said, well, we're going to decentralize the group more and more, and we want to empower these are big stations in other countries, Scotland, big Century brands. And so really it's either you should go and work for one of these big stations in the north, or it's time for you to move on. And quite frankly, I said, no, it's time for me to do something different. This is so I took the option of what they say now, a restructure. And it was one of the best decisions that I made that was partially made for me, because it forced me to go off and do something different, learn different skills, and set up my own business and acquire stations and licenses, and then part of how I ended up here in Australia. So that was 24 years ago. So a long time. But sometimes you need someone to come in and say, look, time out, we're going in different directions. And that was definitely something that Paul McKenna taught me, is that when you reach a crossroads in your career, or your life, so many people are programmed to keep going forward, and you miss the turning. Like you miss the turning, when you're driving and you're not concentrating, and you say to your partner, I just missed the turning. Why did you miss the turning? Because you weren't concentrating. And when you're not concentrating on your career, you can miss the turning. So I've taught myself never to miss the turning. And that was a turning. I needed to slow down, indicate, and turn left. And it was the next adventure wasn't straight ahead. It was a left turn.
We're having a party. Oh, yeah.
You've got a whole host of amazing stories, which I do want to share on your episode. But there's just briefly, just moving through the next stages. You started that venture with Phil Dowse, who has an incredible radio brain, hasn't he?
Yeah, so Phil's a great friend. We ended up working in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Dallas, Philadelphia, just amazing. It was working for WPLJ and KLOS and WTMX. And you'd finish work on a Friday. And I remember one time we were in Manhattan. I were working with Scott and Todd on The Breakfast Show, doing some consultancy, and Dave finished at 5:00. And of course, we're in the radio studio. Radio stations all over the world are very similar. You're very comfortable. You've got your offices, you've got your studios, you've got your music scheduling, you've got your voice booths. It's all very, very similar. And before the days of cameras in the studio and before people really cared about how studios looked, they were all pretty beige as well, right? But when you finished, you come down the escalator into the office and down to the lobby, and you're in Manhattan. And I was like, oh, wow, this is really different. I'm not in Dunstable anymore. This is a bit different. And it was even different to coming out of Leicester Square, And in fact, it'd be the same Leicester Square when Ashley and I worked really closely together. Ashley was in my team, Ashley reported to me, and it was hilarious to think now, given who he is now and what he owns. But we'd be really working super hard on scheduling something for the weekend. And of course, then you come down to the square and the world was going on. And you would be in the bubble of the office and the studio, and you'd come down and realize this was Leicester Square. This was Times Square. This was Hollywood. This was middle of Chicago. So Phil and I went on that international journey together. I mean, it was very much a fly-in, fly-out business. We didn't ever, but we never lived in the States. But it was. I remember one time when we were pitching for some work in LA, and the general manager said, "Oh yeah," I said, "I really want to work with you. Can we have breakfast?" And I've got this idea I want to pitch. I think it was Thursday, and he says, "Okay, meet me at 11:20 La Cienega Boulevard on Monday morning, 8:00." And I was sitting in Dean's Hangar and Milton Keynes on a Thursday at 4:00, and he just said, "Meet me at 8:40 at whatever it was in La Cienega at this coffee shop, and we'll talk about it." And I was like, just about to say, "But I live in England," and I didn't get the words out. And I said to my wife, and I said, "I'm just going to have to go." So I just got on the plane, arrived Sunday, went to this cafe. And the only reason this guy, John Davison from Disney ABC Radio, was he drove down La Cienega down to KLOS, and he decided that was a convenient place for him on a Monday morning. And I was like, and anyway, I pitched him this idea, and we ended up working for KLOS for 2 or 3 years. That was a good investment. But yet again, another left-hand turn. Someone else would have said, "Well, I'm in England. I can't be in LA on Monday. And if I am going to be in LA on Monday, are you going to give me the cost of my flight?" No, none of those things were relevant. The American decision maker wanted to meet at 8:15 in LA, face to face, no Zooms in those days, and we did it. And so it was an amazing adventure. We worked on lots of reality radio formats, and that gave me that real taste for international radio.
Also, I want to talk about Shazam, because you wanted to get into digital media, and that little tiny startup, Shazam, you kind of fell into that and supported those guys. Was it for free? Wasn't it for a couple of years?
Yeah. So another person who was at that conference was now a good friend of mine called Chris Barton, and he had this idea about everything we knew what would happen. If you've ever spoken to a receptionist at a 90s radio station, you would know the number one thing the receptionist would always have to deal with, which was calls into reception saying, "We're just having an argument in the office, and at 11:10, can you tell me what that song was?" Now, whether you're a receptionist at Key 103, Radio Clyde, Chiltern Radio Capital, anyone who manned the phones in the 90s would say, "Yeah, that was like thousands of calls a week." And he literally built $1 billion business out of that idea and said, "How can I solve that problem of what's that song?" And because it came out of this idea of radio, and radio at that point was the predominant place that people would discover new music, whether it's Radio 1 or Z100 or Capital, they wrote an algorithm to detect music on a Nokia phone. This was 7 years before the iPhone. And he contacted me after an article I'd done in the Music and Media magazine about my vision of how the music industry was going to digitize. And bearing in mind, we were all collecting CDs at that point. And he pitched me this idea, and he said, I can't pay you. I haven't got any money, but I can give you some of these things over here. What are they? They are some shares in the company. I said, I don't need shares in the company. I need money. He goes, I haven't got any money. You'll have to take these valueless shares. And so 18 years later, the not so valueless shares as the company got acquired by Apple for 1 billion Australian dollars. So it's about 480 million US dollars. But it was 18 years, and Chris and Diraj and Philippe and Avery were the 4 founders. And it all came from that passion for radio and what's that song? And anyone listening will be nodding now. Yeah, I remember that. And of course, Shazam lives on today, native into iPhone and Mac. And I think there's 250 million people a month still Shazam songs. Now they do it on TV shows and movies and movie cinemas and clubs. And I was very proud to play a very small role in the co-creation of what became an internet verb.
What annoys me most about that is that I didn't think of that idea myself.
Yeah, same here. It wasn't my idea. All I needed to do was connect the dots, pitching the idea to Rob Stringer and Lucien Grange and John Kennedy, saying this is how people are going to listen to music in the future. And they sort of looked at me really strange. I said, Clive, this is what you're doing now. You really should get a real job. And yeah, it was, but because I could, they built a database but even if we had thought of the idea, John, the secret wasn't the idea. The execution was the idea, was the gold, and that execution meant building this algorithm that could identify up to from 20 million songs in 10 seconds. So I didn't stay at school long enough to have a chance of doing that. Much smarter people than I could do that.
I would say a majority of people who work in radio are technically really bad as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think the industry went through lots of different technical revolutions. In the 80s, it was about databases and word processors and, making the office more simple. Then by the late 90s, it was hard drives, which meant we could digitize music. And for us at Chiltern, it was about digitizing ads before music, because that's where the money was, which was a very smart decision of the team to not to digitize music, because it was still quite expensive to digitize the ads and do split ads. And then the next evolution of technology came through the internet in 94, and Capital Interactive was one of the first companies to have a fully fledged interactive business by 1995. And then, of course, as we go through, then it became the mobile internet and the App Store. And that's actually what I do with my career now. I work for a big telco here in Australia. And so actually, although I'm not a technologist, because I've always been fascinated by the role that technology can play to make our lives better, simpler, faster. Inside the radio studio, I was always or radio company, I was always the slightly younger one, not anymore, of course, which meant that, and most people feared technology. And because I came through an era where I didn't fear it, I was fascinated by it. It became a big part of my career without actually being an engineer or technologist. But you're right, mostly inside radio businesses, the technology skills are held within a few amazing engineers who do a great job.
All those engineers in radio are all very similar as well. If you ever break anything, they just tut and then shake their head, and then they'll fix it within minutes. They're all the same.
Totally.
All right, I want to just roll through the next few bits because, of course, I want to get to Absolute. But your passion to get back into radio returned. You bought Juice. You bought Passion in Oxford. You turned it into Jack. You then, correct me if any of this is wrong, but you then tried to buy EMAP. Of course you did. We've all done that. We all tried to buy a massive radio group. How does that, can I just ask, I'm not very intelligent, Clive, so forgive me, but did you just pick up the phone and go, hi, it's Clive Dickens. I want to buy your company. I mean, how do you try to buy a company like EMAP?
Well, with the smaller businesses like the Jack business and Passion, these businesses were, running out of money, and we had a little bit of money, and we made a little bit of money out of Juice, and UTV bought us out of Juice, and that became the bedrock of the Juice Liverpool business had gone really well, so we made a little bit of money out of that, and then they went on to buy TalkSport and do really well. And then with the local businesses in Oxford, these were very, very small businesses. Therefore, if you phone up and say, I'd like to buy a company, but the next question is, have you got any money? Now, when it came to the EMAP deal, ironically, sometimes it's a little bit easier to buy bigger companies than smaller companies, because people who advise you make fees out of a percentage of the transaction. So I can't remember what the EMAP price was. Maybe it was £400 million at the time. So that getting to the stage where we were the underbidder to the Bauer family was actually quite straightforward, ironically, because the businesses were profitable, so you could borrow money from the profits to fund it. And you could get really smart people advising you legally and financially, because they would make a percentage of 300 million. So therefore you'd actually attract money and you could borrow money. And I remember being in a management meeting and having Dee present to us, which is really odd because we're all peers. Dee is a fantastic character for the industry, and her employer EMAP had put the business up for sale, so she had to do the spiel to say this is a great business. And we walked into Lazard Bank in London, and it was like, party number 3, and it's me and Donna and Adrian, and it's like, oh, hello. Last time you seen him was at a sort of Radio Academy meeting or the Sony Awards or something. And during the coffee break, you're trying to find out what's going on with all of the other parties. And I said, so who's, who have you, and it's all very secret. And they're going, who else is in it? She goes, oh, well, I can't tell you, but I can tell you, it was this really, really crazy out there family, which I tell you, I would be very surprised if they get it. So I won't mind telling you them, but it was this German publishing family. But that was very random, she said. Anyway, we went back in, the rest is history. We were the underbidder. It was the Bauer family, and she had a phenomenally successful career working for Yvonne and the Bauer family. But of course, they came literally from the outfield because they were trying to buy the magazine assets. And I think either Yvonne's father had said, well, actually, let's just buy the whole business. And Bauer now, I think, is one of the biggest owners in radio in Europe. And Vivian, who's running that, I think is doing a great job. But it was a bit of an accident from what Dee told me. But back to your question, really, it's a little bit about that left turn, right turn. If you just ask, in sales training, you're always told, just ask for the money, ask for the order. You don't get anything if you don't ask for it.
Now, from that, of course, you then go on to buy Virgin, which of course then gets rebranded to Absolute. I mean, tell me about the excitement, the emotions when you finally got your hands on the keys of Virgin.
Yeah, look, we had to effectively go the other side of the world to find the money, because by the time 2007 was kicking around, the term the credit crunch had been coined. We hadn't quite got into the credit crunch, and therefore the capital markets were drying up. And so we'd done some work with a very creative and successful radio owner in India. And as the sort of last idea, why don't we talk to Samir and Vinny, to the Jane family and Mr. Puri, and see whether they would like to be part of this adventure. And yet again, I remember phoning them up on the Thursday, and they said, well, let's meet in Mumbai on Saturday morning. And it was a bit like the LA story. I'd get on a plane, jump to Mumbai, and pitch them this idea of transforming this business, which had obviously peaked under Chris Evans' Fantastic Breakfast Show, but had, was still very profitable, but, in my opinion, needed a fresh approach. So yes, it took a long time from 2007. We finally got the keys to the car in June 2008. The economic markets had obviously deteriorated further, but we were unswathed. And by September of that year, we had 100 days to debrand the business. And that was tough because that wasn't just the business, it was the website. And, we didn't want to just junk the whole website. We wanted to keep some of the SEO that the site had. So it was, lived in the West End. Even though as a family, we were living out in Surrey, I just decided to get a hotel room in the West End. And it was, for about 4 months, alarm call at 5 a.m., go to the office, and then hit the hay in the hotel at 11, for 4 months, turning that. It was one of the most exciting periods of my career, working with Christian O'Connell and Frank Skinner, and my business partners, Donna and Adrian. It was just immense. Had 5 incredible years, and I'm very proud of the roots that we played in that, creating that brand. I think their cume now is over 5 million, and when we acquired Virgin, the Absolute Radio Group is 5 million. I think we acquired the Virgin Radio Group, it had about 1.8 million. And within 18 months of acquiring it, we lost audience initially, as we would, because that's how radio works. And within 18 months of a year, we were net positive. And now it's, one of the powerhouse brands of UK commercial radio. And I understand one of the most profitable businesses in the Bauer network. So that was another great moment.
It was a technical problem. You heard something on air you shouldn't have done.
Oh, yeah.
I want to get onto some of your stories, because throughout your career, there are some incredible stories I'd like you to share on your episode. If I just give you the headline, could you give us the story? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Is it true that you almost introduced Posh Spice to David Beckham?
Absolutely. This popped up the other day when that fantastic TV series of David Beckham came up on Netflix, and I remembered that I was guests of Virgin Records at a Chelsea Man U game at Stamford Bridge. What must have been 98, I think, and we were in a box, and 10 minutes into the first half, all of the Spice Girls come jumping into the box. They told us that they were coming, and it was like, come and meet the Spice Girls. This is before, I think it was either maybe Wannabe, it might have been released at number 1, but it's before they obviously were huge. But they were known. And we got introduced to them, and even in a box in a football match, and you can talk because you're behind a bit of glass, rather than Stamford Bridge didn't have seats in front of its box, if I remember. And so Victoria sat down next to me and said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Clive from Capital." Capital Radio, blah, 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 and chat. And she went, "Who's that?" And she pointed to the pitch, and I said, "That's David Beckham. I really like him. He's great. I've been watching him on television. Can you introduce me to him?" And I went, "No, I don't know David Beckham." She goes, "Oh, come on. You can introduce me to him." I said, "I don't know David Beckham. I'm sure someone will introduce you to David Beckham." Anyway, she's sitting chatting, chat. And she just kept nudging me saying, "Come on, take me down to the dressing room and introduce me to David Beckham." And I said, "I can't. I'm not going to introduce David Beckham. You might be able to get in the dressing room, but I'm not getting into the dressing room." "Oh, Clive, come on. You told Clive at Capital you can do anything." Nope, I'm definitely not doing that. Anyway, next thing I looked up at halftime, she was on the pitch at halftime, which is in the documentary. There's a clip of her on the pitch, and she'd gone onto the pitch, and and of course, then she takes over the story, and she ended up meeting him after the match. So she found somebody else to go and introduce her, basically. But I thought, God, that's so weird, And I was telling my team here in Sydney about that, and they were like, "That is the most random story." I said, "Yep, 100% true." One of the privileged things of working for Capital Radio at the time, you get to meet lots of people, and I was a bit disappointed that she didn't mention it in the documentary, to be honest, but I'm not surprised.
You wanted to say thank you to Clive Dickens for
She could have met him 45 minutes earlier if I'd just been a little bit more complicit. That's the thing, right? I was just too following the rules.
Is it true that you nearly died on Concorde with Keith Richard and Mick Jagger? These names, A-list names.
I know. This is like name dropping, clang essential.
I love it though.
It was like, you can Google this, right? So if you type in Keith Richards Concorde, you'll see the story, and there's quite a lot of references to it. So I was actually the guest of Warner Music, and randomly I was going to Prince's house, which is another story, to listen to his new album, which is as you do. And we were going on Concorde because it was fast and fancy. But on this Concorde was Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, Liam Neeson, David Duchovny, Clive Dickens, and a lesser-known journalist at night time called John Ronson. Now, John Ronson is now a very famous author, Oscar-winning author, actually. And I was the Capital Radio music guy, and he was the loaded journalist, and we sat together on the Concorde. And then what happened was we were halfway over the Atlantic, and all of a sudden, literally, Concorde slowed down really fast. And we're like, what the hell is going on? The captain came on and said, I'm really sorry, nothing to worry about, but one of our engines has developed a fault, and it's no danger. And we're thinking, yeah, bullshit, it's no danger on Concorde, one of the engines is gone. There was a fire we could see out the window. And he says, we can only fly subsonic now, we have to fly back to London. We can't fly to New York under policy. We go pick up another Concorde in London. It's like, what's going on here? And of course, there's Keith. And any of your audience ever been on Concorde? It's a very, very tiny plane. It's 222. Yeah. So, and it's not very long. So it's only single class. So everyone is basically excited to be there. You're chatting, it's Keith Richards. I remember Keith Richards' daughter's there, Mick Jagger was there, David Duchovny, Liam Neeson. They were regulars on Concorde. They were like, yeah, whatever. But anyone on Concorde would be like, how is this your first time? Everyone would be like at this little club. And all of a sudden, everyone was really scared that this plane was going to crash. And there was a real chance it might. And John Ronson led over to me and he said, don't worry, Clive, we're not going to die today. He says, because if we die today, it will be Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, Liam Neeson, and the 100 others who died on Concorde. He says, my life is not destined to be one of the 100 others who dies with the Rolling Stones. So I know that you're not dying today. And he was right. Now, he got an Oscar for writing the screenplay for The Men That Stare at Goats. But even back then, he knew that his life was bigger than that. In fact, John tells that story now because he's a famous author, screenplay writer, and he tells that story on chat shows. Yeah, it was an incredible experience. And we got back to London. I phoned my wife and said, don't worry, we didn't crash, and we're going on another Concorde. And we flew back over to Prince's house and had a party at Prince's house. It was a very surreal experience, John.
Does John Ronson mention your name when he's on TV?
He does. No, he does mention the bloke next to him, which is me. The bloke next to him, who quote John, seemed to be more worried about the compensation that he might get in Marks and Spencer's vouchers if for being late on Concorde, which I do remember saying something along those lines. So he's not wrong, but I am literally mentioned as this random next to him. So I've got tickets to see John in November in Sydney, and I've got him in the front row. And if he tells that story, I'm all primed and say, John, it was me.
Just a couple more of your stories then, please, Clive. Back to radio. The first London Party in the Park, which of course was in Hyde Park, nearly got cancelled minutes just before the first act. Can you tell us why?
Yeah, so we had an amazing lineup. Richard had secured the venue. We were working with the Prince's Trust. We had this vision, or Richard had this vision of copying what was happening in Boston, where this radio station did this massive annual event where acts would do like 15, 20 minutes. They're very common now. But in that period in 97, 98, it was pretty new. We put together the lineup. This was very naive times again. And we had what loosely resembled contracts, but they weren't contracts like we know them now. They were at best a release form. And these, you got 120,000 people in the park. You got massive stages. You're live on Channel 4. You're live on Capital. Tarrant's there, Penky's there, Foxy's there, Martin Collins, all getting geared up. And it became aware to me that the managers of the artists weren't happy that they hadn't signed their release waiver. They were like, hang on a second, we didn't know this was on TV, we didn't know this was live on the radio. They were thinking that there was someone making money. The only people making money out of this were the Prince's Trust, but it wasn't clear. So this was literally minutes before, and I called up the in-house lawyer at Capitol saying we've got a real problem, and they sent down a partner from our law firm, and we literally drove around Hyde Park, around Marble Arch, I remember in this light blue BMW fancy car, rewriting each of the contracts by hand. And then I had to run past Speaker's Corner, back up onto the stage, and put them in front of all the artists before they got on. Otherwise, the whole thing would have been cancelled because we hadn't done, we hadn't bought our A game on that occasion. But and sitting there very aware that this very big thing did come down to this. I can't remember who the name of this lawyer was, but he was, one of these amazing lawyers that would just go, okay, it was fine. We can do this and we can do this. And I said, well, can you come up and help me get the signatures? He went, hell no, I'm just the lawyer. You've got the relationships. You're going to have to get them to sign it. I've just got something here that is fair and reasonable that they will sign. So yeah, it was seat of the pants stuff. And obviously by the next year we were all sorted. But bear in mind, you had people like, Shania Twain, Elton John, Backstreet Boys, they're huge global artists as well as the pop acts of the day. So, but we got there.
Got there in the end. And just one final one. Is it true that vodka nearly ruined Absolute?
Yeah. So, we launched Absolute Radio on mid-September 2008. It was sort of year in the planning, and it had been 3 months of blood, sweat and tears. And the Friday afternoon before the launch, where Christian was going to launch on the Monday morning, 8:15 or 7:45, we got 25 boxes of liberate files delivered to Golden Square, but effectively a cease and desist letter from Absolute Vodka that was then owned by the Swedish government, saying you can't launch on Monday, you're plagiarizing Absolute Vodka, and we're giving you fair and reasonable notice to cancel the launch on Monday. Bear in mind the TV ads were made, everything was done, we've done all the media. And if you don't comply with this, we're going to injunct you. So you either do this nicely or we're going to go to the court and you'll be injuncted. And it was like, oh my gosh. And now, obviously, that didn't happen. We launched, but that brought on a 2-year, very expensive court case with Absolute Vodka that we ultimately settled out of court with them on. And we weren't injuncted. And one of the reasons we weren't injuncted is because actually they hadn't brought their A game on that day, because they hadn't actually realized that we had a trademark. We'd registered and been operating the trademark for a number of years. We had all the URLs. We'd done all our protection. But they just believed that they owned the word. Bearing in mind the word is spelled differently, operating in very different classes. It was very naive of them to do it, but they were trying to stamp on what they thought was the little guy. And in fact, there was we weren't just Clive, Donna and Adrian. We had backers. We had done all of our homework. But there's nothing more scary than having a big cease and desist letter planned on a Friday, and then the potential of a injunction. But thankfully it didn't happen. They didn't succeed, and we settled peacefully out of court, and the rest is history.
Did you raise a glass that night? I'm guessing not of vodka.
In fact, actually, I've got one of our major defense arguments was that there was no way that people get confused about a radio station that played rock music on an FM and DAB dial that had Absolute with an E versus a iconic vodka brand that you would was obviously without an E. I said, there's no way and one ever get confused by that. And look, and mostly no one ever would get confused about it. But actually, a couple of years ago, I was in a restaurant and I got a picture of it in this restaurant. I can't remember where it was. I was traveling somewhere, and there was on this drinks list and on the spirit section, right down the bottom, it had Absolute vodka with an E as one of the drinks that you could choose. And I'm thinking, wow, that's amazing. Thank goodness the lawyers at their time didn't find that restaurant.
Yeah. Just been in there for lunch just before the meeting. That would have been painful, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah.
You've worked with so many people throughout your career, presenters. Who are some of your favourite people that you've worked with? Yeah,
look, I've mentioned most of them consciously in our conversation today. And it's, Richard, Paul Jackson, David Mansfield, was fantastic. Richard Eyre was one of the original CEOs of Capital, Foxy, Chris Tarrant, Steve Pank. The list is enormous. My own business partners, Don O'Driscoll, Ian Walker, Anthony Timpson, Adrian, just 42 years of incredible experiences, incredible relationships, and those early pioneers back at the crazy days of the Hot FM and Chiltern Radio, Colin Mason, Paul Chandler, obviously sadly departed just a few weeks ago, Paul Robinson. It's, they are hugely influential over my career and my life, and I still intend to be working for at least another 15, 20 years. Anyway, but radio UK radio has a very big place in my heart. We, at some point in the next couple of months, hope to bring Jack FM back to UK radio, which you can read about that at jackfm.co.uk. And that partly is because I just can't imagine not being involved in some way in UK commercial radio. And learning from those incredible pioneers has been the greatest privilege.
Do you still, because you've achieved so much, do you still have any ambitions now, or what do you want still from radio?
Yeah, so I practice this principle called unlearning and relearning, and working now in telco and having worked in television as well, you come back to the heart of this being storytelling, people, and purpose. And I think I've worked in 17 different countries in my career. And so it's not a geographical thing that I want to look at doing next. It's not a technology thing I want to do next. Actually, what I'd love to do, the one thing I've never done is work in public broadcasting, non-commercial broadcasting. I feel very strongly in an AI world that there is a massive role for public broadcasters, the ABC, PBS, the BBC, in creating what's called a large language model around public broadcasting for purpose rather than for profit. And so many of the big hyperscalers are creating large language models for profit, and we live in the capitalist world, so that's important. But I think it's going to be super important that public broadcasters and not-for-profit content storytellers do create large language models. And I'm hoping that I could, in the future, play a role convincing public broadcasters and public radio stations to understand how the AI generation is going to change everything. And having never worked in public broadcasting anywhere in the world, that still remains a very big ambition.
What you've said there about AI is going to scare a lot of people, Clive.
The fear that people have over AI is no different than people fearing steam trains, the cars, planes, electricity, the internet, the death of radio, whatever your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather feared. It was just the fear of change. And actually, the world is, in my opinion, has become a better place for the advent of technology, but you have to play an active role. And I think AI will also make the world a better place, but we have to be active. You can't be passive. You can't let it happen to you. And, anyone listens to this podcast and you're wondering what you need to learn, then put some time aside and learn how AI can make your life, your business, your everything you do better. And that's what I'm doing now.
Oh, yeah.
So, Clive, what I often ask my guests is, who would you like to hear on their own episode of Crunch and Roll?
I think it would be great to have Richard Park. You know, like you very kindly said that I was one of the most mentioned people, but the most mentioned person on Crunch and Roll is Richard. And Richard, if you're listening, you have to come on. Otherwise, I'll give him an AI plugin that can replicate your voice. And you don't want that. We need the real Parky.
Do you think Parky would listen to Crunch and Roll? Do you think he would have done in the past?
I think the great thing about these content, they're quite evergreen. So eventually they come to you, right? It's, whether you listen to it week in, week out or month in, month out, but you've got evergreen content here. And I think that at some point in time, someone will send him a link saying, hey, he said the most talked about person on Crunch and Roll, and surely he should be listening.
Well, Clive, thank you so much for being on Crunch and Roll. Has it been as painful as you thought?
Oh, you're such a pro, John. You make everyone feel so comfortable. It's only when I listen to it back, or maybe I won't do that, and I think, oh God, did I say that? Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Who did I forget to mention? But you and I do listen to every episode. I really enjoy it, and it's quite cathartic. And you and Simon do a great job doing your research and producing. So thank you.
Well, let's go back to those overnight shows on Chiltern.
You've been listening to Crunch and Roll with me, Clive Dickens. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app to get every new episode as soon as they drop. Crunch and Roll is a 969 media production presented by John Fox and produced by Simon Bosowski.
Oh, yeah.